When it comes to rock and roll, John Lennon is often hailed as a revolutionary icon, yet not everyone in the music world shared that admiration. Despite being one of the most celebrated and influential figures in rock history, Lennon managed to rub several of his peers the wrong way. Whether it was due to his bold political activism, controversial artistic endeavors, or deeply personal fallouts, some of music's biggest legends went beyond disliking him. They outright despised him. From tense interactions to public feuds, these 6 legendary artists didn't just have a minor grievance with Lennon. They had strong, often vocal animosity. Let's dive into the details of who these figures were, starting with the king himself. Elvis Presley. Though they were 2 of the most iconic musical figures of the 20th century, the sole meeting between Elvis Presley and John Lennon was anything but cordial. Behind the scenes, Presley held a growing disdain for Lennon that would only deepen with time. Political differences, conflicting ideologies, and personal contempt created a divide that would never be bridged. Some reports even suggest that Elvis played a role in attempts to have Lennon removed from the United States. Their infamous encounter took place in 1965 at Presley's Los Angeles home, arranged by journalist and music publicist Chris Hutchins, who hoped to facilitate a meeting between Elvis and the Beatles, artists who once held the king in high regard. But the mood soured quickly. Tension emerged immediately, largely due to the stark contrast in their political ideologies. Lennon, a staunch critic of the Vietnam War and a devoted pacifist, quickly noticed decorative table lamps shaped like covered wagons, each inscribed with the phrase, "All the way with Lyndon B. Johnson." This slogan, associated with the then-president's aggressive war policies, infuriated Lennon, who didn't hesitate to express his disapproval. His anti-war remarks clashed harshly with Presley's patriotic views and support for U.S. policies, turning what could have been a historic moment into an awkward confrontation. According to Hutchins, Presley was visibly irritated by Lennon's outspoken political views. The discord at that first meeting laid the foundation for a long-standing resentment that only intensified. The friction didn't end there. By 1971, Presley's dislike had grown so intense that he took the unusual step of appealing to J. Edgar Hoover, the then director of the FBI. During a private meeting at FBI headquarters, Presley accused Lennon and the Beatles of undermining American values, citing their disheveled appearance, provocative music, and influence on the counterculture movement. He claimed they promoted rebellion, drug use, and anti-government sentiment. At the time, Lennon was embroiled in immigration issues, while he and Yoko Ono sought permanent residency in the US. His continued anti-war activism, particularly his outspoken criticism of President Richard Nixon, had already made him a target of government scrutiny. Presley's complaints only added fuel to the fire, likely intensifying the pressure from federal agencies. What began as a disappointing meeting had now spiraled into a covert political vendetta. Bob Dylan. The relationship between Bob Dylan and John Lennon was far from straightforward. Built on mutual admiration, competitive tension, and eventual rivalry, the dynamic between these 2 legends reveals the fragile line between influence and resentment. In the Beatles' early years, Lennon found himself captivated by Dylan's deeply introspective and poetic lyricism, a stark contrast to the Beatles' earlier, more upbeat love songs. Inspired by Dylan's storytelling approach, Lennon began integrating more personal, emotional themes into his own work, evident in tracks like In My Life and You've Got to Hide Your Love Away. Yet while Lennon held a deep respect for Dylan, the feeling was not entirely mutual. Known for his rebellious attitude and biting humor, Dylan didn't appreciate what he perceived as Lennon imitating his artistic style. Rather than seeing Lennon's shift as a tribute, Dylan viewed it as a form of artistic appropriation. By the mid-1960s, Dylan had already established himself as the voice of the counterculture movement, raw, underground, and unapologetically rebellious. In contrast, the Beatles, despite their evolving sound, were still seen by many as commercial pop icons. Dylan wasn't interested in sharing the countercultural spotlight. The tension became more visible in 1965 with the release of the Beatles' Rubber Soul, an album that clearly bore Dylan's influence. One track in particular, Norwegian Wood, This Bird Has Flown, stood out. The song's acoustic style, melancholic tone, and narrative structure closely resembled Dylan's signature sound, and he wasn't thrilled. A year later, Dylan responded with a subtle but biting musical critique. Fourth time around, from his seminal album Blonde on Blonde, was widely interpreted as a parody of Norwegian Wood. With eerily similar melodies and themes, but laced with sarcasm and emotional detachment, the song felt like a direct jab. Not only did Dylan release the song publicly, he reportedly even played it for Lennon in person. The experience left Lennon unsettled. While known for his own sharp wit, Lennon wasn't accustomed to being on the receiving end of such targeted derision. Accounts suggest he left the encounter unsure if the song was a joke, an insult, or both. Though Lennon never publicly confirmed his reaction, those close to him believed he was shaken. The incident marked a turning point in their relationship, highlighting the complex mixture of admiration, rivalry, and unspoken hostility between two of music's greatest icons. Steely Dan. In the early 1970s, John Lennon's song Imagine emerged as one of the era's most iconic and divisive anthems. While many praised it as a heartfelt plea for global harmony and brotherhood, others criticized its dreamy idealism as either naive or deeply hypocritical. Among the more vocal detractors were Steely Dan, the sophisticated and acerbic jazz rock duo consisting of Donald Fagen and Walter Becker. Known for their sharp wit and layered satire, Steely Dan used their music to challenge what they saw as shallow or performative idealism, taking direct aim at Lennon with their 1972 track Only a Fool Would Say That from the album Can't Buy a Thrill. At the core of Steely Dan's critique was the belief that Lennon's calls for a utopian society were disconnected from the harsh realities faced by everyday people. While Lennon promoted a vision of a world without borders, religion, or materialism, Fagen and Becker saw a troubling contradiction between that message and the lavish lifestyle Lennon enjoyed. Living in luxury, playing a grand Steinway piano, and surrounded by the trappings of fame, Lennon, in their eyes, was hardly the embodiment of the anti-materialist prophet he claimed to be. Only a fool would say that was coated in irony, its mellow rhythm and sunny instrumentation cleverly concealing the barbed cynicism in its lyrics. The song insinuates that only someone comfortably removed from the struggles of the common person could afford to dream of the kind of world Lennon envisioned. Through Donald Fagen's silky delivery, Steely Dan essentially labeled Imagine as a fantasy. Pleasant to hear, perhaps, but fundamentally unrealistic in practice. Frank Zappa Steely. Dan wasn't the only act of the time to cast doubt on Lennon's peace-driven persona. Another outspoken icon, Frank Zappa, also took issue with what he viewed as hollow activism. A musical maverick known for his biting social critiques and disdain for conformist thinking, Zappa considered much of the counterculture movement, including Lennon's role in it, as superficial. Though Zappa and Lennon briefly appeared on stage together in 1971, their philosophical differences were immediately apparent. Zappa, a staunch individualist, approached slogans and broad-stroke movements with deep skepticism. He questioned the sincerity of those who wore the badge of activism while enjoying celebrity status and wealth. In his view, Lennon, despite his peace rallies and anti-war stances, was playing a role rather than living the ideals he preached. For Zappa, Lennon's activism wasn't so much a mission as it was a method of staying relevant. This perspective reflected a broader concern that some artists used political causes more for self-promotion than actual change. While Lennon may have rallied against war and greed, he did so from a place of immense privilege, a contradiction that critics like Zappa found hard to ignore. Interestingly, Lennon was not blind to the irony in his public image. He often admitted that the lyrics of Imagine were aspirational rather than a literal reflection of his life. In interviews, he acknowledged the disparity between his message and his personal lifestyle. Alongside Yoko Ono, he used his platform to push for peace while simultaneously enjoying the luxuries of success. Lennon would later concede that his role in the counterculture was not that of a perfect leader, but of a flawed human being, still searching for truth like everyone else. Todd Rundgren. During the early 70s, Todd Rundgren was enjoying a creative and commercial peak, earning acclaim for his genre-blending sound and meticulous studio work. Hits like Hello It's Me and I Saw the Light solidified his reputation as a pop innovator, with an ear for both catchy hooks and experimental production. Although Rundgren's work clearly bore traces of the Beatles' influence, particularly their later, more psychedelic period, he didn't extend much personal admiration to John Lennon. In fact, he was one of the few musicians of the era who publicly criticized Lennon's solo career and political ambitions. As Lennon transitioned into his post-Beatles identity, his music grew more introspective and overtly political. Albums like Plastic Ono Band, 1970, And Imagine, 1971, revealed a man grappling with inner demons while addressing larger societal issues. Songs such as Working Class Hero and Give Me Some Truth positioned him as a spokesperson for the disillusioned and disenfranchised. Meanwhile, his relationship with Yoko Ono and public activism elevated him to near-mythic status in the counterculture movement. But Rundgren wasn't buying it. He regarded Lennon's vocal activism with suspicion, framing it as a publicity stunt rather than a genuine call for change. In a blunt 1974 interview with Melody Maker, Rundgren accused Lennon of using revolution not as a goal, but as a tool. "All he really wants to do is get attention for himself," Rundgren said. "And if revolution gets him that attention, he'll use revolution." These sharp comments portrayed Lennon as more of a showman than a statesman, someone more interested in headlines than in hard solutions. Unsurprisingly, Lennon took issue with Rundgren's statements. Never one to shy away from confrontation, Lennon responded with an open letter in which he challenged Rundgren's assumptions and motives. "I don't represent anyone but myself," Lennon wrote. "It sounds like I represented something to you, or you wouldn't be so violent towards me." His reply underscored the personal nature of the attack and implied that Rundgren's harsh words may have been fueled more by resentment than by honest critique. This exchange revealed a deeper rift within the music world about the artist's role in politics. To some, like Lennon, using fame to promote change was a moral duty. To others, like Rundgren, it was a potentially disingenuous act, especially when it came from someone as globally adored and financially secure as Lennon. Joni Mitchell. Joni Mitchell and John Lennon were undeniably two of the most influential and groundbreaking singer-songwriters of their time, each transforming the musical landscape through their own distinct voices and visions. Mitchell, with her poetic and deeply introspective lyrics, became a cornerstone of the folk music movement. Meanwhile, Lennon, first as a member of the Beatles and later as a solo artist, emerged as a voice that encapsulated the spirit of a generation. Despite their parallel contributions to music, the relationship between these two towering figures was far from harmonious. Their interactions were frequently laced with unease, and a subtle but persistent tension arose, in part due to Lennon's unsolicited critiques of Mitchell's work. By the early 1970s, Joni Mitchell had carved out a unique and powerful niche within the world of folk and rock music. With landmark albums like Ladies of the Canyon, 1970, and the seminal Blue, 1971, she broke new ground in songwriting. Blue in particular was a revelation, a soul-bearing collection that laid bare themes of heartbreak, emotional evolution, and the painful beauty of love and longing. It stood as a revolutionary achievement, reshaping the singer-songwriter genre and leaving an indelible impact on artists for decades to come, from Prince and Lana Del Rey to Taylor Swift. John Lennon, following his departure from the Beatles, had embarked on his own journey of self-exploration through music. By the time Blue was released, Lennon had already introduced Plastic Ono Band, 1970, and Imagine, 1971, albums that channeled his personal struggles and political views with raw, often confrontational energy. While both artists were introspective in their work, their creative languages were distinctly different. Mitchell's songwriting was lyrical and layered, almost novelistic in its emotional complexity, while Lennon's compositions often leaned toward bold proclamations and ideological slogans. It was perhaps inevitable that their artistic philosophies and personalities would collide. When they eventually met, their impressions of each other were far from flattering. The core of their discord appears to have stemmed from an instance in which Lennon gave Mitchell unsolicited feedback on her music, advice she had not asked for and did not appreciate. The specifics of his comments have never been made entirely public, but it's clear that Mitchell found them patronizing and unwelcome. Given Lennon's well-documented tendency to speak bluntly, sometimes to the point of insensitivity, it's likely his critique lacked tact. Mitchell, fiercely independent and devoted to preserving her creative autonomy, wasn't someone who took criticism lightly, especially when it came from someone she felt didn't fully comprehend her artistic vision. She believed her work spoke from a place of nuanced emotional truth, something she felt was often misunderstood or undervalued by outsiders. Adding to the strain was Lennon's general attitude toward the folk genre, which he occasionally dismissed as overly introspective or self-indulgent. His skepticism toward singer-songwriters may have intensified the divide, painting Mitchell's emotional depth as something he couldn't or wouldn't fully engage with. His reputation for being cutting and direct likely made any critique sting even more. Over time, Mitchell would publicly acknowledge her own discontent with Lennon. In a rare moment of candid critique, she did not shy away from sharing her opinion. While the music world often revered Lennon as a near-mythic figure, Mitchell was unimpressed by the pedestal on which he was placed. She viewed him as deeply flawed, and at times, she believed his activism rang hollow. His public messaging not always reflected in his behavior. To Mitchell, the disconnect between Lennon's ideals and his actions was significant. She refused to let his celebrity overshadow what she saw as inconsistencies in his public persona. Unlike many of her contemporaries, she wasn't afraid to look past the legend and speak her truth, regardless of how it might be received. Frank Zappa and John Lennon were both iconic innovators in the world of music, yet their brief artistic intersection in 1971 ultimately ended not in triumph, but in disappointment and dispute. Zappa, celebrated for his experimental edge and uncompromising personality, found himself at odds with Lennon, not over musical philosophy, but due to what he considered blatant appropriation. Their fallout was the result of a single performance that spiraled into a long-standing disagreement over credit and artistic ownership. The event in question occurred on June 6, 1971, during one of Zappa's performances at the famed Fillmore East in New York City. At the time, Lennon, freshly post-Imagine, was exploring more unconventional musical paths. Having connected with Zappa, whom he respected for his non-traditional approach, Lennon, along with Yoko Ono, joined Zappa and his band, the Mothers of Invention, on stage for an impromptu jam session. It was a moment that had the potential to be a legendary collaboration between two creative powerhouses. That night's performance was electric, unpredictable, and packed with improvisation. The jam featured several free-form pieces, one of which was King Kong, a well-known Zappa composition he had been performing since the late 1960s. The chemistry on stage seemed natural, with Lennon and Ono contributing their distinctive vocal improvisations to Zappa's structured yet chaotic musical terrain. At the time, all seemed cordial and creatively charged. Lennon appeared genuinely enthusiastic about the avant-garde nature of the session, aligning with his own post-Beatles desire to push musical and artistic boundaries. However, any goodwill born that night was short-lived. The controversy erupted the following year when Lennon included a live recording from that evening on his 1972 album Sometime in New York City. The issue? The track King Kong had been retitled Jamrag, and all songwriting credit was attributed solely to Lennon and Ono. Zappa was given no acknowledgement for what was unmistakably his own work. For Frank Zappa, this was not a mere clerical error. It was a violation of artistic integrity. In interviews years later, Zappa expressed clear disappointment and anger over what he described as outright misappropriation. "John just took the master tapes and released it as if it were his own," he explained bluntly. "I don't have anything against him personally, but that was a really low thing to do." To an artist like Zappa, who had built his entire career on fiercely defending creative independence and standing up for the rights of musicians, the incident was a betrayal. He had always positioned himself in opposition to the commercial music machine, and for Lennon, an artist who publicly championed peace, honesty, and artistic freedom, to disregard those same values behind the scenes was especially galling. Adding to Zappa's frustration were the editing and production choices on Lennon's version of the performance. When Zappa finally released his own version years later on Playground Psychotics in 1992, it starkly contrasted Lennon's remix. Zappa's release remained raw and authentic, offering a faithful record of what had actually taken place on stage. In doing so, he made it clear that King Kong was indeed his composition, and highlighted just how much Lennon had altered the original material for his album. Though Zappa never expressed personal hatred toward Lennon, the incident left a sour taste and permanently shaped his view of the Beatle. He continued to speak out about the event throughout his life, never shying away from calling out what he believed was an egregious ethical lapse. The situation was steeped in irony. Lennon, who had spent so much of his solo career preaching about authenticity and justice, had apparently ignored those very principles when it came to another musician's work. This episode remains one of the lesser-known, yet telling stories about creative clashes between major artists. It serves as a reminder that even legends can find themselves on opposite ends of integrity and ego. Conflicts like this one between Zappa and Lennon reveal the fragile balance between collaboration and competition in the world of music. What are your thoughts on these behind-the-scenes disputes involving John Lennon? Let us know your opinion in the comments below. If you found this video interesting, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.